Hey folks, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Second Son Woodworks. My name is Caleb. Today I'm going to be showing you how I installed these 3 new ceiling joists in my garage workshop. Hope you'll stick around. This was a project that was almost purely born out of necessity. The ceiling joists in my shop and the roof have been sagging for quite some time. I've had a number of people comment on the look of the ceiling when they've come into my shop, and so I decided to work with my landlord to do something about it. So after cruising down to the local lumber yard and picking up 4 separate 20-foot long 2x4s, I was part of the way through what would be a pretty long project, and I did my best to document all of it, and I hope to create something that is helpful to you if you find yourself in a similar situation. Oh, and by the way, you should hit that subscribe button. It'd be really helpful, and it would make me smile. Like I mentioned before, a number of people have commented on the sagging roof in my shop when they have come into my shop. It's usually when I'm showing something and or we're grabbing surfboards or something, and the straw that broke the camel's back, as they say, was when my engineer girlfriend was in the shop, and we had a long and extensive conversation about what needed to be done to fix this sag in the roof. And also, part of the reason that it was sagging was because you can see here that I use it for quite a bit of storage for surfboards and some wood. There's a bed up there that belongs to my landlord and a few other things. And I will be having a new roommate moving in here soon, and he has 2 surfboards, or 1 paddleboard and a surfboard, and then a couple bikes. And before I do anything to create storage for those new things in the shop, I felt like it was a good idea to go ahead and reinforce the roof of this old shop. Now, I'm going to say right off the bat that I am not a professional contractor, and or I am not a engineer. But like I said, after talking to a number of people, including my girlfriend, who is an engineer, as well as another local contractor, I figured out a pretty good plan to fix this roof, or to give this roof some additional support, because you can see that these 20-foot ceiling joists that were installed when the garage was originally built are sagging quite a bit. Another thing that I should mention right off the bat is that this garage has had a good amount of termite damage. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the project, but that was certainly having an impact on the overall structural integrity of the shop. I might be a little bit crazy, but I also think that I could see the sag in the top of the roof. You can see here that I went outside. That might just be because of the angle of the camera, but it needed some work. And so, like I said earlier on in the project, or earlier on in this video, I decided to work with my landlord to do something about it. And I essentially just communicated with her and figured out a plan. And I worked with this other contractor who has done some work to the house, and we came up with a pretty good plan to install several new ceiling joists that are 20 feet across. And in order to do that, the first step was to remove some 2x4s that were used as spacers between the different sections on each side where I plan to install the very first 20-foot long ceiling joist. Now, since the conception of this project, it has been difficult to keep track of the various terms that are used to describe a ceiling like the one in my shop. And so I'm going to use this little photo that I found on the internet throughout the video, and I will do my best to reference the different parts of the roof according to this photo. So the ceiling joist will be the thing that I will be installing, but I'll be talking about a couple different parts of the roof throughout the video. Before installing the new ceiling joist, the plan was to attach several 2x4s to one of the existing ceiling joists, the ceiling joist that is in the middle of the shop, and then using a car jack to lift the roof and actually shore it up before installing the new ceiling joist. So I took one of the 4 20-foot long 2x4s that I picked up at a local lumber yard in Santa Barbara, California, and I cut it to a length so that it could reach all the way up to the ridge board at the top of the ceiling and go down almost all the way to the ground, but leaving enough space for my car jack to sit just underneath it so that I could use the jack to actually lift the roof. Now, if you're going to be doing something like this, make sure that you are very safe. And also, don't blame it on me if something goes wrong, because like I said, I am not a professional, but this did work. I will say that. And if you watch the rest of this video, you'll see how it turned out. So before attaching the 2x4 that is perpendicular to that ceiling joist, to the ceiling joist with some construction screws, I wanted to make sure that it reached all the way up to that ridge board and then all the way down to the ground and had enough space so that I could put that car jack underneath it. And then, after making sure that the length worked out, I went ahead and attached the 2x4 directly to the ceiling joist. And so the idea is that when I lift the jack and it lifts the ceiling joist, it will also lift the point of the ridge board, which, by the way, is in this shop extremely destroyed by termites. So kind of scary. Talk a little bit more about that later on in the project. But with a roof like this, the support comes from the connection between that ceiling joist and then the 2 rafters that make up that triangle. So I needed to essentially lift the main pressure point of the triangle of this roof before attaching new ceiling joists. And you can see here that I attached an additional 2x4 to the outside so that it would be actually pressing up on the underside of the ceiling joist. And then I used another piece, a scrap piece of 2x4, so that the area where the jack would be pushing was just a bit bigger than just one end of a 2x4. And then it was time to jack the roof up. Now, once again, if you are going to be doing something like this, be very careful and take your time. Take it slow. Don't try to raise the roof too quickly where it could come down. Okay. Make sure. I feel like a lot of termite stuff is going to fall when I do this, because the rafter up there has been eaten up, or the one that's at the center of all the different parts. So I'll get the terminology for the video. All right.
Okay.
So if you didn't hear that noise of the roof being raised by the jack, go ahead and rewind and listen more carefully to the noise that the roof makes as I lifted the jack up underneath those 2x4s. Because I knew that the roof had certainly moved after listening to it and also watching it, but I didn't know exactly how much it had moved, and I didn't want to move it too much. I went ahead and grabbed the step stool and did some measurements. Earlier on in the project, I made sure to write down all of the measurements just next to the
92
2x4 that I had attached to that ceiling joist, and I took the measurement from the ground all the way up to the bottom of the ceiling joist, as well as from the bottom of the ceiling joist up to the bottom of the ridge board. And that way, after I did just a bit of the movement with the jack, I could measure the difference and see how much the roof had moved.
Still see a bit of bow. I'm going to pump on it a bit more. Very slowly. Very slowly. Okay. Is nerve-wracking. A little over 92 and a half. Haven't changed much. I guess 92. We've gone up about half an inch. I'm gonna go take a look at it from outside. This is scary. Pump some more. Almost to 93. It's looking pretty good. Both of them moving. That beam in the middle. It's almost just completely shot. I'm gonna pump a little more. This is freaky!
It's pretty difficult at this point to tell, apart from the measurements, as to whether or not the roof looked any different. I walked around a bit, and you'll see some video here, and I walked back outside and looked at the outside of the roof. The outside looked like it may have moved a little bit, but once again, it's just such a small amount of movement in the roof that it was difficult to really see it. But I knew from the measurements that I had moved the roof up an entire inch from where it was before I jacked it up with the car jack. Now maybe you can see a difference in this roof from the video at the beginning of the video. Let me know in the comments below.
2x4.
Now, at this point in the project, it was time to take a rough measurement of how long the first ceiling joist that I would be installing would need to be. But as you will see later on in the project, I had to cut off a bit more from these ceiling joists as I installed them than the measurement foretold, because in order to get them into the area where they will be sitting, you have to make them just a bit shorter, so you can essentially push one end in and then be able to move the other end up into the area. You'll see more about that in a second. It was funny for one of these beams, because the miter saw station that I have was just not long enough for these 20-foot long 2x4s. I tried to use my truck hood as a spot to set it on, and it ended up scratching my truck, but good thing my truck is old and I don't really mind. You can also see here that I'm taking off a rough cut angle on each end of the ceiling joist, or what would be the ceiling joist, the 2x4. Once again, this is just to help be able to get the beam up into placement. You can see here that it is a struggle to be able to actually get the beam up into position without having the roof off, or the actual, the outside roof, because you just can't fit it in. So I ended up having to cut the 2x4 just a few additional times, and during all of that, I was moving these 2x4s back and forth, and it was a workout. I was feeling pumped after it. Like I said early on in this video, I am no professional contractor, and I would be interested to hear from those of you out there who maybe are a professional contractor and who have worked with this type of ceiling and with ceiling joists like this, and maybe there is a way to calculate how long they need to be in order to be able to squeeze them up into the area with the roof on. Let me know in the comments. Once I cut the first ceiling joist 2x4 down to the appropriate length to be able to squeeze it up into the area in the roof where I would be attaching it, I went ahead and used some 2.5-inch screws, some construction screws, and attached it to the 2x4s that were already a part of the roof. And once again, to reference this photo that I found on the internet, what I am attaching the ceiling joist to is the actual rafters, as they are called in this photo, of the roof. And in addition to the 2.5-inch screws, I did use a couple 3-inch long screws just to give it some extra support. Now, after finishing adding the construction screws to this first ceiling joist on each side to each of those rafters in the roof, I decided I wanted to take down the jack to see how much the roof would shift. I don't think this is actually a very good idea now that I think about it. You'll see here in a second that it does kind of drop.
Right. It does. That's all the weight off.
Like I said, now in retrospect, I don't think that was the best idea to take the jack down before installing all 3 new ceiling joists. But it didn't do any permanent damage, and I end up jacking the roof back up and then moving on to installing the next 2 ceiling joists. I almost forgot that before moving on to the new ceiling joists, I went ahead and installed 2 struts, which is what they are referenced or called in the photo, but to the first ceiling joist. When my engineer girlfriend and I were having a conversation about this roof and doing some brainstorming and some planning to figure out a way to reinforce the roof, we talked about these struts, and she kind of mentioned that they didn't actually do a lot to the overall structural integrity of the roof, but it kind of seems to me like they could do a little bit of something. Not exactly sure. She is the engineer and I am not, but I'd be interested to hear what all of you out there think about this. Once I began to move on to the second ceiling joist that I would be installing in the garage workshop, I was feeling a whole lot more confident about the process. And to kind of reiterate the steps, the very first step was to remove these 2x4 spacers that were in the existing roof next to those rafters so that I could install the new ceiling joists. And this one was a difficult one, as you can see.
That was not an easy one.
I'm assuming that these spacers that are in between the rafters were installed when the original roof was put on, not for really any part of the structure itself or to support the structure, but more to space out those rafters as they installed those. A little DIY trick that I will pass off to you if you are in a situation where you need to measure a long distance, you can use a little hand clamp, spring clamp, to clamp the tape measure, and then you'll be able to stretch it all the way. I probably didn't need to do the measurements again, but I just wanted to make sure that I didn't cut too much off of those 20-foot long 2x4s, because once I did, then they wouldn't be very useful for this project. So just take little bits off at a time is what I would recommend. These 20-foot long 2x4s were about $25 a piece with tax here in Santa Barbara. Another thing that I would be very interested to hear from you, the viewer out there wherever you are, is how long or how much would a 20-foot long 2x4 cost you in your town, wherever you are, especially with how much lumber has gone up recently. Like I said earlier on in the project, moving around these big long 2x4s and maneuvering them in my small shop was a workout. I feel like my arms were getting pretty pumped, which is kind of cool because then I have bigger muscles. But if you are doing something like this, make sure that you are careful moving those big 2x4s around. You don't want to knock something over and or break something. So take it easy, take it easy. If you have been watching this video until this point, 25 minutes in, thank you. I appreciate your attention to my videos. If you haven't hit the subscribe button below, you should do it now. I would greatly appreciate it. You can hit the little bell icon next to it so that you get a ping when I release new project videos. I've been doing my best to release project videos on a weekly basis, but sometimes they're a little bit over a week, sometime around then. But either way, I got some cool stuff. Go check out my library and build something cool. Thanks for watching. When I was installing these struts, I didn't do any particular measurements to figure out the distance that I needed to attach them on the ceiling joists as well as on those rafters. I tried my best just to kind of mimic the placement of the struts on the older ceiling joists, the ones that were in the garage originally. But once again, to kind of beg the question what you think about those, you should leave a comment below if those measurements do matter. What do you think? When I went to install the last ceiling joist, I went to move this new little rolling lumber cart that I had built and I was very excited about, but unfortunately one of the wheels broke as I was moving it over that crack. I got a couple other videos about that, so go check them out. I'll put them up in the or down in the description or the link or wherever. Because of the way that the garage was designed with the door on the front and then at the back side of the shop there is a full wall, I would certainly say that the back of the shop is the most structurally sound because it has that full wall. But nevertheless, I decided to install the third ceiling joist at the back side of the shop, and the process was just the same as the first two. First needed to take some measurements, and then I went ahead and cut the joint, the 2x4, down to the right length, and I ended up having to take off just a bit more once again, and I did some rough angled cuts with my circular saw at the ends to help be able to maneuver this long ceiling joist up into place. Once the ceiling joist was in place, I then once again used some 2.5-inch and 3-inch construction screws that were self-drilling to tap into the ceiling joist to connect it to the rafters on each side of the roof. And this pretty much completed the project. I needed to add 2 struts, and then I was almost done. Alright guys, you can see here that I have installed 3 separate 20x20 stretchers, beams, but I put 3 of them in, and now it's time to take down the jack, which is going to be scary. Last time it kind of made like some noise. I don't really want to do that often to this roof, but I'm hoping that these additional beams will add a bit of support. We'll see. Let's do it. A little nervous. Well, that was an intimidating process there at the end. Hopefully you saw those slow motion videos of the roof moving when I released the jack. But now the roof has those 3 additional ceiling joists, and it was certainly looking better than it did before. And after doing some additional measurements, it was clear that the roof was in better shape.
That was sketch, but did it. That was super sketchy. There's a bunch of termite damage up there in the main beam that goes from, one end to the garage to the other. Whew.
Alright folks, that does it for another episode of Second Son Woodworks. My name is Caleb. Let me know what you think about this project. If you have any questions or comments, leave them all below. Check me out on Instagram and now TikTok, also Facebook, and check out all my other videos. And get in the shop. Build something cool. Thanks folks.